The sound of silence. Jack Hayes, a successful but overworked writer, was desperate for an escape. The relentless noise of the city, cars honking, phones ringing, people shouting, had eroded his sanity to the point where even the simplest of tasks felt overwhelming. He had spent years writing stories set in the chaotic world he had grown tired of, but now he longed for a place of quiet, a place where he could find peace and finally finish his novel. A letter arrived one morning, a perfect opportunity. A small, remote village in the countryside, Oakwood, tucked deep in the hills, offered him a cottage for rent at a remarkably low price. The letter promised tranquility, inspiration, and solitude. Jack, excited at the prospect of peace, packed his bags and left the city behind, eager to leave the noise of his life in the past. As he drove further away from the city, the roads became narrower, the trees denser, and the air grew cooler. Finally, after hours of winding through forests and past small, sleepy hamlets, he arrived at Oakwood. The village was quaint, picturesque, a place frozen in time. The cottages were old, but charming, with moss growing along the stone walls and chimneys puffing out the faintest trace of smoke. Jack's new home was a modest stone cottage at the edge of the village, nestled between a forest and a wide, dark river. The land around it was wild and untamed, perfect for long walks or hours of uninterrupted writing. He smiled to himself as he unpacked, the noise of the world seeming so far away. This was the escape he had been searching for. The villagers were kind but reserved. They greeted him with polite nods but rarely lingered in conversation. At first, Jack attributed this to their rural nature, but he soon began to notice something unsettling. The village seemed unnervingly still. There was no chatter in the streets, no distant laughter or the sounds of children playing. Even the birds seemed to quiet as the sun began to dip below the horizon. On his first evening in Oakwood, Jack decided to take a walk. As the sun set, the village transformed into a shadowy silhouette against the darkening sky. He wandered toward the forest, breathing in the cool air, but he soon felt the eerie silence weigh heavily on him. There were no sounds of insects, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, nothing. It was as if the world itself had gone mute. Confused but not yet alarmed, Jack returned to his cottage and settled down to write. As the night grew darker, a peculiar thing happened. The silence seemed to deepen, to spread throughout the room. The clock on the wall ticked, but the sound didn't reach his ears. The soft tapping of his fingers on the keys of his typewriter seemed muffled, distant. A deep, unsettling quiet filled the air, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He rose to his feet and opened the window, hoping to hear the usual sounds of the countryside, wind rustling through the trees, a dog barking in the distance. But there was nothing. The world outside his cottage remained as still as the air within. That night, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he was haunted by the profound silence, as if the village itself was holding its breath. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were plagued by strange visions, blackened skies, an endless void, and shadowy figures that whispered in the darkness, their words lost to the quiet. The next morning, Jack went into the village to buy supplies. He asked the shopkeeper about the silence he had experienced the previous night, but the man only looked at him with a deep, sorrowful gaze. "Don't talk about it," the shopkeeper warned in a low voice. "The silence is a curse." Jack frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean? Is something wrong with the village?" The shopkeeper shook his head. "You'll understand soon enough. Just don't go out at night. Whatever you do, don't be outside when the moon rises." Jack was taken aback. He had heard of superstitions in remote places, but this was something else. "What happens at night?" he asked. But the man remained silent, as if afraid to say any more. The conversation ended there, and Jack left the shop with more questions than answers. Later that evening, curiosity gnawed at him. Despite the warning, he decided to stay up that night and investigate the silence. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, Jack sat at his desk, writing furiously to distract himself from the growing tension in the air. Suddenly, just as the clock struck midnight, the silence became unbearable. It wasn't just a lack of sound, it was as if the very world around him had been swallowed whole by a void. The ticking of the clock was gone, the creaking of the cottage gone, even the thudding of his heartbeat had vanished into nothingness. The silence pressed down on him like an invisible weight. Then, he heard it, a faint whisper. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the whispering grew louder. It seemed to come from all around him, from within the walls of the cottage itself. "Do you hear it?" the voice hissed. "The silence is not peace. It is the price we pay." Jack's blood ran cold. He ran to the window and looked out, half expecting to see something in the darkness. But all he saw was the empty street below. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie, pale glow over the village. Terrified, Jack bolted out of the cottage and into the street, his footsteps muffled by the unnatural silence. As he walked further, he saw other villagers, their faces pale, their eyes empty. They moved like ghosts, shuffling along the street, their mouths locked in silent screams. It was as if they were trapped in a world where sound had been banished forever. Jack approached one of them, an elderly woman, and tried to speak to her, but no words came out of his mouth. It was as if the air itself had stolen his voice. He gestured frantically, trying to get her attention, but she didn't respond. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and he saw the terror in them, the terror of a soul trapped in a silent nightmare. That's when it hit him, the curse. It wasn't just the village that was affected. The entire region was bound by this unnatural silence. A curse that rendered everything mute under the moonlight. No birds, no animals, no voices, nothing but the oppressive stillness. Panicking, Jack ran to the riverbank, hoping that the sound of flowing water might break the curse, but even the river was silent, its waters still and lifeless. He collapsed to his knees, screaming in his mind for someone, anyone, to help him. But the silence swallowed his cries. And then, from the darkness, the whispers returned. "You shouldn't have come," they hissed. "We warned you. Now, you will never leave." In that moment, Jack understood. The silence wasn't just a curse on the village, it was a trap. The villagers were not the victims, they were the keepers of the silence. Once you arrived, you became part of the curse. And there was no escape. As the moon reached its peak, Jack felt the last of his words vanish from his lips. The silence consumed him, and the village, too, faded into the quiet forever.